Hey, what is up guys, it is me Flavio here, back with another Mafia City video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you a tier list for all the 49 vigilantes that are currently in the game. In this tier list, I'll be grading vigilantes into 6 different categories: gray, green, blue, purple, orange, and gold. Gray being the worst category and gold being the best one. I'll also be classifying them into 4 different march types: the tanker plus combatter march, the tanker plus rider march, the tanker plus shooter march, and the tanker plus combatter plus rider march, because not all vigilantes are good for all 4 march types. The reason why I'm using these 4 march types is because they're the most common march types used in the game, and they're also not very complicated. So now let's get started with the vigilantes one by one. The first vigilante we have is Adriana. Adriana does not have any battle skills, and so I've classified her as gray for all the 4 march types. Catalina again does not have any battle skills, so she has also been classified as gray for all 4 march types. Then we have Suri, who gives you 25% bulker defense. Now the bulker defense helps all of these 4 march types because all 4 march types use tankers in them. And that's the reason why I've classified her as green for all 4 march types. Then we've got Ethan. Ethan gives you 50% shooter attack, and he also gives you 30% crime op speed, which is not really a battle skill. So because of the 50% shooter attack, I've classified him as orange for shooters, and for the remaining marches I've classified him as gray because he doesn't really help with combatters and riders that much. Then we've got Bruce. Bruce gives you 50% bulker attack and 25% bulker health. Just like Suri, the 25% bulker health does help all 4 march types, which is why I've classified her as green for the rider and shooter marches. I've classified him as orange for the combatter march because this 50% bulker attack does help combatters a lot. And I've classified him as purple for the combatter plus rider marches, again because of the 50% bulker attack buff. Then we have Marcus, who gives you 10% bulker defense, 5% bulker health, and 20,000 ops capacity. The bulker defense and health helps with all 4 march types because all 4 marches use tankers, and the 20,000 ops capacity obviously helps with all 4 marches as well, which is why I've classified him as blue for all 4 march types. Then we've got Andrew. Andrew unfortunately gives you vehicle attack 50% and vehicle health 25%. However, since nobody uses vehicles these days, I've classified him as gray for all 4 categories. Then we've got Paul, who gives you 50% biker attack and 25% biker health. Obviously, I've classified him as orange for riders, classified him as purple for combatters plus riders, and gray for combatters and shooters because he doesn't really buff your combatters and shooters. Then we have Angie. Angie is a great passive vigilante, however, her active skills aren't that good. She only gives you 30% crime op speed, which is not really a battle skill, and so I've classified her as gray for all 4 march types. Then we've got Firelord. Firelord gives you 25% crew attack, which helps all 4 march types, 10% bulker health, which again helps all 4 march types, and 10,000 ops capacity, which also helps all 4 march types, which is why I've classified him as purple for all these 4 marches. Then we've got Tracy. Tracy again is not a battle vigilante. She gives you 50% vehicle attack, which is useless, and she also gives you 50% gathering speed, which is great for growth but not very good for battle. So that's why I've classified her as gray for all 4 march types. Then we've got Wendy. Wendy gives you 10% crew defense, which is great for all 4 marches, 10,000 ops capacity, again great for all 4 marches, and 25% bulker and biker damage. Now in my opinion, 25% bulker and biker damage is way better than 50% bulker and biker attack, which is why I've classified her as gold for combatters and riders, and also combatters plus riders, but I've classified her as green for shooters. Then we have Melvin. Melvin again does not have any active skills, so I've classified him as gray for all 4 marches. Then we've got Izumi, who gives you 15% shooter attack and minus 30% enemy biker damage reduction. If you watch my video on elite troops, you probably know that you should use tankers and combatters to counter tankers and bikers. This is why I've given it orange for combaters, because the minus 30% enemy biker damage reduction debuff will help your combaters counter the enemy bikers much more effectively. Then she also has 15% shooter attack, which is why I've classified her as blue for shooters. And I've given purple for combaters plus riders, because combaters plus riders are used to counter other combater plus rider marches. And the minus 30% enemy biker damage reduction debuff helps reduce a lot of the damage done by your enemy riders. Then we have Caesar. Caesar gives you 30% crew attack while attacking turfs, and minus 10% bulker damage reduction. You normally use shooters to counter bulkers, which is why I've classified him as purple for shooters. I've classified him as gray for combaters plus riders, because he doesn't really buff your combaters and riders. For combaters plus riders, I've classified him as blue because, again, he does help reduce the enemy bulker damage. Then we have Nick. Nick gives you 20% bulker attack, which is great for bulkers, 15% crew defense, which is great for all 4 march types, and 35,000 op size, which again is great for all 4 march types. This is why I've classified him as purple for these 3 marches, and as orange for the bulker march because of his extra 20% bulker attack. Whoops. Then we have Charles. Charles is gray for all 4 marches because he does not have any battle stats. However, he's great for the family treasure event if you want to use him there, because he gives you 20% resource tile attack and defense. Then we have Keko. Keko gives you 30% shooter health and 30% vehicle health, which is why I've classified her as gray for combaters and riders, green for shooters, and gray for combaters plus riders as well. Then we have Albert, who gives you 30% bulker defense, which helps with all 4 march types, which is why I've classified him as blue for all 4 marches. Then we have Don Ollie, who gives you 10,000 ops capacity, minus 10% enemy bulker and biker defense, and minus 25% enemy attack reduction, which is why I've classified him as purple for all 4 marches, because all those stats help all 4 march types. Then we have Frankie, who gives you minus 30% enemy bulker damage reduction. You normally use shooters to counter bulkers, which is why I've classified him as orange for the shooter march. I've also classified him as purple for the combater plus rider march, because the minus 30% enemy bulker damage reduction does help reduce the enemy combaters damage a little. And I've classified him as gray for the tankers plus combaters and tankers plus rider marches, because the minus 30% enemy bulker damage reduction doesn't really do much for those 2 march types. Then we have Gilbert. Gilbert gives you 15% biker attack, which is great for bikers, 10,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 march types, and minus 30% enemy defense reduction, which again is great for all 4 march types. So I've classified him as purple for combaters, riders, and I've classified him as purple for combaters, shooters, and combaters plus riders, but I've classified him as orange for riders because of his extra 15% biker attack. Then we have Holly. Holly again is not a battle vigilante, so I've classified her as gray for all 4 march types. However, she does give you the 50% resource tile attack buff, so you could use her during the family treasure if you have her maxed out. Then we have Connor, who gives you 10% shooter damage, 10% biker charge damage, which is great for bikers and shooters, 10,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 march types, and 30% crew health, which again is great for all 4 march types. So I've classified him as purple for combaters and purple for combaters plus riders. However, I've given him orange for riders and orange for shooters because of his 10% shooter damage and 10% biker charge damage. Then we have Vlad, who gives you 10% crew health, 30% biker attack, and 30% biker charge damage. Obviously, Vlad is gold for bikers because of his 30% biker charge damage, which is huge. I've also classified him as orange for combaters plus riders because the 30% charge damage is going to help a lot in this march as well. And I've classified him as green for combaters and green for shooters because he doesn't really buff those troops that much. Then we have Jane, who gives you 30% bulker attack, 30% bulker defense, and 30% bulker health. She also gives you 10,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 march types. The 30% bulker health and defense also help all 4 march types, since all 4 march types use tankers. So I've given Jane purple for riders, shooters, and combaters plus riders, and I've given her orange for combaters because of her extra 30% bulker attack. Then we have Sebastian, who is not a battle vigilante, so I've classified him as gray for all 4 March types. Then we have James, who is basically the Jane for bikers. He gives you 30% biker attack, 30% biker defense, and 30% biker health. He also gives you 10,000 ops capacity. Because of his biker buffs, I've classified him as orange for riders and also purple for combaters plus riders. However, I've given him green for combaters and shooters because he doesn't really help with combater and shooter stats. Then we've got Alan, who is great for all 4 March types. He gives you 30% crew defense and also minus 10% enemy defense reduction, which is why I've classified him as purple for all 4 March types. Then we have Anita, who gives you minus 5% enemy crew attack and defense. She also gives you some buffs for City Royale and Clash of Mafia. However, other than those 2 events, she's not a very good vigilante, which is why I've classified her as green for all 4 marches. Then we've got Melanie, who gives you 20,000 more ops capacity, which helps all 4 March types, which is why I've classified her as blue for all 4 marches. Then we have Ryo Sakurai, who gives you 30% bulker attack and 30% biker attack. He also gives you 10,000 ops capacity, so I've classified him as purple for bulkers and bikers, or combaters and riders, green for shooters because he doesn't really help with shooters, and purple again for combaters plus riders. Then we have Steward, who gives you 5% crew attack and defense. He also gives you 10,000 ops capacity and minus 10% enemy biker attack and minus 10% enemy biker defense. Since you normally use combaters to counter bikers, I've given him blue for combaters, and for the remaining March types I've given him green. Then we have Ai Sakurai, who again is not a battle vigilante, which is why I've classified her as gray for all 4 March types. Then we have Aniko, who is just like Anita. She gives you minus 5% enemy crew attack and defense reduction, and she also gives you 35% attack and defense while attacking turfs. However, she's not very good for the tournament, which is why I've classified her as green for all 4 March types. Then we have Patrick, who gives you 10% biker health, which is great for bikers, 10,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 March types, and 25% crew dealt damage, which again is excellent for all 4 March types. As I mentioned earlier, 25% damage is way better than 50% attack. This is why I've classified him as gold for all 4 March types. Then we have Subin. Subin again does not have any battle skill, so I've classified her as gray for all 4 March types. Then we have Keon Nguyen. Keon gives you 10,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 March types. He also gives you minus 30% enemy bulker and biker attack and defense reduction. This is why I've classified him as purple for combaters because they're normally used to counter bikers. I've classified him as purple for shooters because they're normally used to counter bulkers. For riders, he doesn't really do much, which is why I've given him green. Then we have Sandro Nagato, who gives you 30% bulker attack, 30% bulker damage, and 10,000 ops capacity. He's obviously gold for bulkers, mainly because of the 30% bulker damage. He's also orange for combaters plus riders because of the same reason, and for riders and shooters I've classified him as green because he doesn't really buff them that much. Then we've got Harry. Harry gives you minus 25% crew received damage, which is probably the best stat in the game, and also 10,000 ops capacity. Now, I've classified him as gold because I think the minus 25% damage received reduction debuff is extremely strong. However, if you've watched my video on hidden caps for stats, you probably know that there is a hidden cap on the damage received reduction buff, and if your buffs have already reached that cap, you're not going to benefit at all from Harry's 5th skill. This is why you should probably test how good Harry is in the tournament or in the real estate event before you start using him in actual battles. Then we have Itosai Ogami. Itosai Ogami gives you 10,000 ops capacity, 35% attack during Family Treasure, and 35% attack during Conqueror's Path. Again, another vigilante that is good for cross-server events but not very good for the tournament, which is why I've classified him as green for all 4 March types. Then we have Sevamolovic, who gives you minus 10% enemy bulker attack reduction, 12,000 ops capacity, which is great for all 4 March types, minus 30% enemy bulker defense reduction, which again is great for all 4 March types, 30% vehicle damage, which is not good at all. This is why I've classified him as blue, because of his minus 30% enemy bulker defense and 12,000 ops capacity. Then we have Doryong Zen, who is probably the best shooter vigilante in the game. He gives you 30% shooter damage. He also gives you minus 10% shooter received damage, 12,000 ops capacity, and also minus 30% enemy biker defense reduction. Because of his 30% shooter damage and minus 10% shooter received damage, I've decided to give him gold for shooters. I've also given him purple for combaters because of his minus 30% enemy biker defense. For riders, I've given him green because he doesn't really help that much with riders. And for combaters plus riders, I've given him blue, again mainly because of his minus 30% enemy biker defense. Then we have Stefano. Stefano gives you 30% biker attack, minus 30% enemy vehicle defense reduction, 12,000 ops capacity, and 10% biker charge damage. Because of his 10% biker charge damage and 30% biker attack, I decided to classify him as orange for bikers, and also purple for combaters plus riders. As far as shooters and combaters are concerned, he's not that good, which is why I've classified him as green. Then we have Keiji Yamaku. Keiji gives you 10% Vulgar health, which helps all 4 March types, 12,000 ops capacity, which again helps all 4 March types. He also gives you 30% bulker damage, which is excellent for bulkers, and minus 30% enemy shooter defense reduction, which is great for biker marches. This is why I've classified him as gold for combaters, purple for riders because of the shooter defense debuff, green for shooters because he doesn't really help that much with shooters, and orange for combaters plus riders again because of the 30% bulker damage. Then there's Kazuma Kiryu, who gives you minus 35% enemy biker and vehicle attack, which is why I've classified him as blue for combaters, gray for riders and shooters, and green for combaters plus riders. Then there's Goro Majima, who gives you minus 35% enemy bulker and shooter attack. The bulker attack debuff is great for shooter marches, while the shooter attack debuff is great for rider marches. For combater marches, he doesn't really help much, which is why I've classified him as gray for combaters, and I've classified him as green for combaters plus riders. And finally, we have the 2 shooter vigilantes, Nora Su, who gives you 30% shooter damage, and Jose, who gives you 35% shooter damage. They're obviously gold for shooters, but for the other March types, I've classified them as gray. So those were all the 49 vigilantes in the game. I'll be uploading this tier list on my website very soon with all the vigilante names and their grades for all 4 March types. And if you want to download this full Excel sheet, that's going to be available on my Patreon very soon. Before I end this video, I'd like to thank all of my patrons for the support. If you want to support me, there's a link to my Patreon in the description below. So that's all I had for you guys in this video. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Thanks for watching the video, guys, and I will see y'all in the next one.